Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Tobe Hooper's 1974 slasher film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So this is one of the most important and influential horror films that really helped shape the contours of the modern slasher film as it develops in the late 70s and into the 80s. Texas Chainsaw Massacre uses the trope of the masked killer, which becomes very, very popular. It uses power tools as one of the primary killing weapons, which becomes very, very powerful. And it uses the sort of ethos of the motiveless killer. In this case, a family of killers, in fact, serial killer cannibals. It also picks up in a number of interesting ways from a film like Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. Because in Psycho, right, Norman Bates has preserved his mother's dead body. Similarly, in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the family of serial killers has preserved the dead body of their grandmother and the nearly dead body of grandfather, who's incredibly old, but still moderately alive, apparently. So, basically, there's actually not that much plot to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Basically, you have a group of people, late teens, early 20s, something like this. Sally Hardesty, her brother Franklin, who's in a wheelchair, Jerry, who's the driver of the van, and then Kirk and Pam. They're on a sort of road trip. Initially, they stop off at a cemetery, and actually the film opens with this information that several graves in this cemetery have been desecrated, and somebody created like a meat statue with the rotting corpses, and then took parts of the other corpses. And this was actually inspired by Ed Gein, or Gain, I can't remember how his last name is pronounced, who was a real Wisconsin. I think he only killed 2 people officially, so I don't know if he counts as a serial killer, but he was a murderer and a grave robber who made furniture and like household household stuff out of corpses he stole from local graveyards. So this is actually one of the inspirations, real world inspirations. So in it, Sally and Franklin's grandfather was buried in this cemetery. So the first thing that this group is doing is going to check the grave to make sure that it's not one of the ones that's been desecrated. Then they go up to the grandfather's house. And they're just sort of checking it out. It's this old, rundown, dilapidated house out in like rural Texas. Their van is running out of gas, and so Kirk and Pam, who have gone off to find the swimming hole. I don't know why I put scare quotes around that one. They've gone to find the swimming hole so they can swim. They've gone to look for a place to have sex, realistically. But there's no water in the swimming hole. And so Kirk spots a house over the sort of ridge of the old swimming hole. So they head over to that house to see if they can borrow some gas. Pam is not thrilled with the look of this place, but there is a generator going, so they know there's gas available. So Kirk actually ends up going into the house when no one responds to him sort of knocking on the door, which is not what you do, just as a point of interest. You don't go into somebody else's house. And Kirk learns that lesson the hard way. In that, Kirk goes back because he hears some noises toward the back, so he goes down this hallway, and then Leatherface steps out, bashes him in the head with a sledgehammer. Has to hit him a couple of times because he doesn't die. And this was actually discussed earlier in the movie because they talk about an old slaughterhouse in the area, and Franklin tells the other members of this little expedition that their grandfather used to work in the slaughterhouse, and so he knew all about it. And there are these sort of gory details about how they used to execute steers, cows, whatever it is. I think it's primarily steers that are used for meat. But they used to execute them by bashing them in the head with a sledgehammer, and that often did not work the first time, so it took multiple goes. By the 70s, as Franklin informs them, they use what I think is called a slaughter gun, which is basically a sort of pneumatic piston that uses compressed air to fire a spike into the cow's brain, into the steer's brain, whatever it is. Anyway, this is a lot of background detail. So, this family has clearly been associated in some way with the slaughter trade. So, Kirk, boom, face full of sledgehammer. Kirk is down. Pam is none the wiser about this. She's just hanging out outside. And then eventually she goes in looking for Kirk. Leatherface, she sort of stumbles into this room just full of bones and feathers and furniture made out of pieces of human skeleton, etc., etc. She starts freaking out, at which point Leatherface shows up and he's like, fuck, there's another person here. He doesn't say that because Leatherface doesn't talk. But he basically has to like grab her, and she's trying to escape, and she's like kicking him, and he's basically got to restrain her. And he takes her back into the kitchen area, and he lifts her up and puts her on a meat hook. So she now has a meat hook. She is suspended from a meat hook in her sort of shoulder. And she's freaking out because she's got a meat hook in her, which is understandable. She's also looking at Kirk's dead body on the table. Leatherface gets his iconic now chainsaw, where the title of the movie comes from, turns it on, and starts cutting up Kirk's body. So a bad day for both Kirk and Pam. Sometime later, Jerry decides he's going to go looking for Kirk and Pam, so he heads out. He finds the same house. Once again, he finds the blanket that Kirk and Pam had taken, goes inside, once again, bashed on the noggin with a sledgehammer, so now Jerry is down. Sally and Franklin are waiting at the van. It's getting dark. They are not real thrilled about this turn of events. Sally wants to go find Jerry. Franklin doesn't want to. He's really he's in favor of let's drive back to that gas station. But Sally says, I'm not leaving without Jerry. Apparently they no longer give a fuck about Kirk and Pam because they never come up again. So that's an interesting bit. So Franklin does not want to be left alone, which I guess is understandable, and especially he doesn't want to be left alone because Sally wants to take the flashlight, which is their only source of light apart from actually the van lights, which are on, even though Franklin claims that Jerry had taken the keys. So I don't know how the lights are on in the van, but So eventually what they settle on is that Sally and Franklin will both go. This is kind of difficult to do because Franklin, again, is in a wheelchair, and they are trying to trek through some fairly dense underbrush with, like, vines crossing the path and a number of smallish trees and things like this. So it's not exactly a wheelchair-accessible area that they're traversing. So Sally ends up pushing Franklin along. They're going. It's dark. Okay. Boom. Leatherface shows up. Chainsaw. Bzz, bzz, bzz. Franklin is now dead. Sally witnesses her brother being cut up by a chainsaw. She freaks out, as you do. She takes off running. Leatherface chases her, and she leads him on a fairly extensive chase, eventually ending up in the house. She closes and locks the door. Leatherface is chainsawing up the door. She goes upstairs to the room where Grandpa is sitting and Grandma is decaying because she's dead. She freaks out again. She comes downstairs. Leatherface has gotten in. She goes back upstairs. She jumps out a window. She manages to flee to the gas station where they had earlier tried to get gas. This is the early 1970s, so the guy was out of gas, gas shortage and etc. The guy comforts her. He's like, hey, whoa, we'll get this all taken care of. Let's sort everything out. I'll take you to the police. He does not take her to the police. He instead beats her with a broom, ties her up, takes her back to the house, because it turns out he's Leatherface's dad. Also, he's the hitchhiker's dad. I didn't mention the hitchhiker earlier, but in the opening sequence, they pick up a hitchhiker who's this weird dude, and he, takes Franklin's knife and, cuts his hand up, and then he uses his own straight razor to slash up Franklin's arm, at which point they kick him out. As you do. So he was just a weird dude. What we learn is that this is a family of serial-killing cannibals. Dad cooks the people that they kill, and while Leatherface and Hitchhiker do the actual killing. Interestingly enough, the character in the movie is called Leatherface. His brother refers to him as Leatherface, rather than referring to him by an actual name, like one would normally have. Leatherface seems to be a reference to the masks that he wears, composed of human skin. So it seems weird that would be his actual name on his birth certificate. But you know what? It is what it is. I'm not going to judge. I am going to judge because they're serial killing cannibals, and both of those are bad things. But you know what I mean. So Pam is basically Sally is basically tied up. They cut her finger and let Grandpa drink her blood. And then they have this weird meal where she's tied up at one end of the table, and then they're going to let Grandpa execute her, which he's not very able to do because he's 1,000 years old. Finally, she manages to escape. She runs out. Hitchhiker is slashing her up with his straight razor. She's still trying to get away. And then he, bam, gets hit by a truck. Big semi-truck. So Hitchhiker, done. Player one exits the game at this point. However, Leatherface is still around. The truck driver stops his truck because he just killed somebody, as you do. He gets out to see what's going on, and Sally, just drenched in blood, comes running at him, screaming, "Help me, help me." The truck driver gets back into his truck, pulls Sally in, they shut the door. Leatherface is trying to jam the chainsaw through the door. The truck driver and Sally, rather than driving off, which is probably what I would have done, they go through the other door, come out the other side of the trailer, and start making their way, just running along the road. The trucker grabs a wrench. As he's sort of fleeing, he turns, he throws the wrench at Leatherface. Leatherface goes down. Chainsaw hits his leg. My leg. Again, he doesn't talk, but So he's now injured. So he can no longer sort of catch up with Sally, even though she's severely injured. Another truck comes along, just a regular pickup truck type thing. Sally, leaps in the back. slowly leaps in the back because she's severely injured, drives off. From her point of view, at the back of the truck, we see Leatherface just like swinging this chainsaw around in presumably rage that both Sally and this truck driver have escaped. Film ends. So, it's an interesting movie. Again, there's not much in the way of plot, really. There's tension around the question, basically, of whether Sally will survive. But of course, from the perspective of 2023, where we have the final girl trope well established, it's pretty clear that Sally is going to survive. From the perspective of 1973, where that trope was not standardized, not necessarily as clear that that would be the case. So there is some tension there. There's also the elements of punishing sexuality in the slasher film. Again, Kirk and Pam have gone off to try and have sex surreptitiously, and they're the first two who get killed. There's the sort of sexism or the fetishization of women's suffering, because Kirk and Jerry and even Franklin are killed quite quickly, and we get very little camera emphasis on their deaths. Pam is stuck on that meat hook, and we have the camera on her for quite a while, and then the entire closing sequence is basically focused on Sally and her suffering, her terror, her pain. So those are all pretty standard things that become really central to the slasher film, and again, this helps set the pattern for that. But I actually think there's something more interesting in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is the presentation of people with disabilities. Obviously, Franklin is one. He is in a wheelchair. It's hard to read Franklin, necessarily, because he's not a particularly likable character. And the film does seem to have a certain degree of sympathy for him, particularly when they get to their grandpa's dilapidated house, because it's clear that Franklin wants to be part of the gang and can't fully be. Like, they've all gone upstairs, and Franklin clearly can't. There's no ramps, there's no elevators. Franklin has a lot of difficulty getting into the house because there's rubble, there's door stops, things like that basically block his path. And he has to physically sort of drag his wheelchair over these obstacles, and no one has stuck around to help him with this. Instead, they've all paired off and gone to do their own things. So there is some degree of sympathy for Franklin, but he's also kind of a petulant character. Like, he's very moody, he's very whiny, he's very he is when Jerry, Sally, and Franklin initially return to the van before Jerry goes off to look for Kirk and Pam, Sally is kind of in a huff, and Franklin is doing that, like, "Are you mad at me?" kind of thing, with a Texas accent. So it is this very sort of whiny, childish type character. And the fact that he's a character with a disability who's made unlikable in this way, I think is really kind of problematic, especially when this is paired with the character of Leatherface, because Leatherface, Hooper, the director, and Gunnar Henson, who played Leatherface, sort of fine-tuned this character together. One of the things that they decided, particularly I think Henson decided, is that Leatherface has a developmental disability. It's not really clear from this film what kind of disability he has, but he's got some kind of cognitive issue. This is why he doesn't speak. This is why he wears the masks, is to sort of hide his own, one almost wants to say lack of personality, but as the character develops over the franchise, it becomes, I think, clearer that the mask is meant to reflect different characters or different attitudes that Leatherface takes. There's the killing mask, there's the pretty woman mask, there's the old lady mask in this original film, and they're worn at different times to signal sort of different attitudes that Leatherface is adopting. The killing mask obviously associated with killing Jerry, Franklin, Kirk, and Pam. The pretty woman mask associated with the meal. The old woman mask associated with domesticity when he's cooking. And actually, so I want to give credit here because Henson went to a school for people with developmental disabilities, and he, I guess, put in a lot of time and effort to try and accurately perform this character as a developmentally disabled character. He tried to figure out how people with disabilities, with cognitive disabilities or developmental disabilities, how they move, how they interact with others, how they engage with objects in their environment, etc., etc. And he tried to portray this as accurately and sympathetically as he can, and there does seem to be some sense that, at least by the standards of 1973, this was a very sympathetic portrait. That being said, he did go to a school for people with developmental disabilities and basically use them as inspiration, so that's somewhat questionable. There's maybe something exploitative there that's of concern. But the bigger issue in terms of representation of people with disabilities is the fact that he's a serial killing cannibal. So this is a bad association. Anytime people with disabilities are depicted in media as murderers, this strengthens the impression in the public mind that people with disabilities represent some kind of danger, that they are a dangerous other. We see the same kind of thing when villains in movies are coded queer, when they're coded gay. Particularly, this creates an unconscious association between gay people or LGBT people more broadly and threat. We see the same kind of thing here, and it's very problematic. Hitchhiker as well seems to have some kind of disability, but it's harder to figure out exactly what's wrong with him. I mean, of course, the whole family are serial killing cannibals, so there's that element. Though it's not clear that of his own volition Leatherface does this, so much as that this is what his family requires of him. But again, having that character who is coded as developmentally disabled being the one who commits all of the murders in the movie, it's a problem for representations of people with disabilities, definitely. Because again, it links in viewers' minds people with disabilities and murder, which is not an accurate representation of people with disabilities, generally speaking.